there are certain people on my team that don't like Collector, particularly don't like the stat profile on Collector. And so I think of the three items here at the top, I think Collector is the most likely add. But again, not guaranteed, right? There are situations where we'd add Lord Doms or Rageblade before Collector. I just think it's the most likely. I want Bard so badly. I would love to do Bard. Bard would be sweet in Wild Rift. I would love the Bard would actually be so sick. I would love to play Bard so much. Um, okay, just want to ask this. Not sure if this has been answered previously or not, but will shield busting abilities be introduced in the near future? So I've talked about this a little bit before. I am a very big proponent of adding something like Serpent's Fang or some kind of anti-shielding mechanic to the game. Um, I am a big fan. I think my team is generally on board. The question here, I think, so this is a way of framing things that I learned from other designers who talk a lot to the community. I think this question is much closer to a when than an if. I'm not guaranteeing that we're going to add shield breaking stuff in the game, but I think we are very likely to do it eventually and to try and do it in a way that is in a way that is like good for us and like good for the players. I think it's something we want to do, right? We think it's good for strategic diversity. We think it's good for like probably good for the item system, probably good for systemic release valves. There's just like a lot of things that are good about shield breaking in the game. And it's more a question of like when can we figure out a good time to do this more so than like do we want to do this? I think we're pretty aligned. We want to do shield breaking items of some kind. Does that mean some champions will never be added because of the complexity of porting them? That's a possibility, but I am honestly not sure what the long-term plan is. That's another thing you'd have to answer a champ designer. Can you tell if based on the call cinematic this year will be based on Void Champ's release since a Void Invasion is coming? I don't know. Could not tell you. Not could not tell you as in I can't tell you, but like could not tell you as in I literally don't know. How did the Senna nerfs land? I just off the top of my head, I believe they landed pretty well in the sense that like we actually got her to do things that we wanted. But I'm not 100% sure about that. I intended that to be a high MMR skewed nerf, and I don't recall how that panned out, so I'm not 100% sure. I don't recall exactly. So sorry, I don't have all the data memorized. Sorry, it's just not possible for us. Um, what do you think about Blade of the Ruin King and Solari Charge Blade? I wish that we could make Blade of the Ruin King like how do I put this? I like that Blade of the Ruin King is a little bit is like actually a good item for like specking into damage. It's like it is an item that literally has no defensive stats on it. I mean, it has vamp on it, right? Like, so it's like sort of defensive in a way, but it's like I like that it's just a damage item that people actually buy. It's typically pretty hard to get bruisers to buy a like pretty like purely offensive item, but it's actually like a reasonable take for a lot of the light fighters, right? Um, I'm overall pretty happy with the state of Bork, though I kind of wish it was a little bit worse for ranged carries. I'm kind of a little bit sad that a lot of like so many of the ranged carry builds are just like Bork into X, like optimally speaking. Like there's so much Bork in the ranged carry builds, which I'm not in love with. Um, I like Bork as an item overall, but I do wish that it was a little bit worse on ranged carries. But it's not enough that I like out there like arguing to my team that we should nerf it for ranged or anything like that. Solari Charge Blade, I think long term, I think we should reshape it. I think Solari Charge Blade has a problem where because it gives 50% crit, it's actually um, not the caster 80 carry item that it was designed to be. It's actually a item for 80 casters that don't normally build crit, which is really weird. It's like it should probably scale with crit instead of giving you a lot of crit, if that makes sense. Like I just I don't know. I don't love it. It's I think there's some problems with it, and I think that long term we should address those to make the item more fit its intended niche of like caster, like crit scaling caster marksman should want that item a lot, but they currently they're just like they're okay with it, but it's not like really their big item. It's actually way better on champions like Yasuo, Riven, Rengar than it is on champions like Lucian or Corki. Not that it's bad on Lucian or Corki. I mean, it's fine on them. Um, anyway, that's my thoughts on those. So I think we should do some changes. Yeah, I agree. The 50% crit's pretty weird. Not that I think it was like a bad experiment. I think it was like kind of an interesting experiment to try out, but I think at this point it's like pretty clear it's not really doing what it was designed for. So I don't know if you follow esports much, but will the ADC meta ever shift from Varus slash APCs to traditional? Some of that's on the competitive players, right? It's like if they don't want to play 80 carries, I mean, we could buff them, but we can't force them to play 80 carries if they don't want to. So The question here is more like, hey, what about the coordinated environment is making them play those things over 80 carries? And I think we would need to have a really strong understanding of exactly what the root causes are, which I don't actually like. I've actually spent some time talking to some pro players, and I don't think they have a super strong understanding of exactly what causes the APCs and the like casters to be more popular than 80 carries. Exactly, it's like I've heard a lot of different theories, but I haven't heard anything of like exactly like this is exactly the reason why the caster style carries are dominant or more present than actual 80 carries. The whole competitive meta is just because there are not any AP junglers and AD champions are stronger mid top. Yeah, I think that's a fair like that's like one of the more common sentiments I've heard. But I'm not entirely convinced that's exclusively true because it's just like Diana jungle is actually pretty good. She might not be good in competitive right now, but she's good. I mean, in PC right now, Diana Yasuo is like a Diana jungle Yasuo mid is like a strong combo, right? It's like I think you could do the same thing in Wild Rift. Might not be as good, and there might be other reasons why that's not good. But like there are some AP junglers that are at least baseline functional. The question is like, are they good enough for competitive and like, are they good in a coordinated environment? It's like maybe not, right? That's a separate problem, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we buffed Morgana jungle was like, hey, we know people want more AP junglers, and so here's a jungler that is AP that, or here's a champion that can go in the jungle that's AP. Okay, sorry. Lots of water. Going through a lot of water. Is it possible to make a rework exclusive to Wild Rift to shift X champion from role to another one, like making Teemo mid slash ADC since it's Marco Mage? Um, I think it is unlikely we would do that. We could if we thought we saw like a really strong opportunity space, or that players clearly wanted to play the champion in that role or something like that, we could do something along those lines. But I think it is unlikely that we do something like that unless the circumstances were such that it was a clear value play to move a champion to a different role. It's possible for sure, but not necessarily something that we're going to do. Diana Jungle might feel good in lower elos because people let her scale for free, but most DP junglers might lack impact till 3 items. Yeah, I mean that's fair. And it's possible that we should do something to address like, hey, maybe there should be an item for AP junglers that gives them more immediate impact on the early game. Um, that's certainly a relevant problem statement. I think that's totally fair. But I also don't have like an easy solution of like, well, we just do this. Like most of the solutions require a lot of things like making an entire item, which is not something we can do easily. So again, it's like it's also there's a lot of like sort of conflating factors here, so we don't necessarily know what the best solution is to any of these because this is like kind of like a nested set of problems, right? It's like, oh, why are the 80 carries more popular? Well, the 80 champions are better in solo lanes, and it's like there's not a good AP junglers to go. It's like okay, so there's APCs. Oh, but what about Varus? Because like Varus obviously doesn't fit this. It's like so I don't know. There's like, and then there's like the nested problems of issues that you get into with like the 80 solo laners and the AP junglers, etc. Right? Like there's a lot of complication going on here and it's just not something I can necessarily get into on stream unless I was just talking about that thing only. So I'm gonna try and move on from there now. Um, so uh, let's see. Okay, so let me just I'm gonna again do the thing where I say I'm gonna not look too much at chat for a little bit. Um, and I'm going to spend some time. Oh, actually, I'll answer this one last question here from Scar with many underscores. What do you think about buffing some champions to make them viable in jungle? I personally would really like to do stuff like that, but it's just not our priority right now because we have other things that are considered to be more critical for us to work on. Like the reason why champions were buffed in jungle on PC was because jungle is really unpopular in PC and low MMR. We don't have as many problems there with jungle and low MMR, and that's like kind of their like motivation to do those things. I personally would like it just from the perspective of like strategic diversity. Like we can put some cool champions in the jungle and people can play them at whatever elo. But one of the intentions there was like the original intentions. I think the Zed one and the Kiana one were more for pro. Um, which I think they hit that goal with Kiana, but like they had some specific goals. We don't necessarily have the same goals for Wild Rift, so we don't have as much justification. Another thing I've also spent some time talking about is like it's harder for us to do off build, so some of those things are just harder for us to do. Not necessarily just making a champion viable at clearing the jungle, but like off builds that clear the jungle are harder for us. Anyway, uh, so I'm gonna not look at chat too much for now, and get through some questions on the sheet here. Okay, hey Nick, what do you think about Wild Rift team priorities in this year coming? I can't really talk too much about them. I would say for my team, one of the things we want to do more of is new content. Like we know players want new items, new, rune reworks, item reworks, big system stuff. We want to do those things. I can't guarantee that we're going to have stuff like that in every single patch because, sometimes stuff happens. Sometimes stuff gets moved out of the patch last minute and we can plan it, 6 months ahead of time all we want. And sometimes things go wrong. Um, but I would say our general, like, our dream would be that we get to ship stuff that, like, from my team, like we get to ship systems and balance stuff that people are excited about in every patch. Like that's what we'd like to do. Um, because we know that some of the patches, including 3.0, were just not the most exciting from the perspectives of like people. Oh yeah, by the way, sorry if anyone has rated me. I don't have my notifications and stuff set up, so apologies if anyone has been like, has been following or whatever. Um, I don't have it's because I couldn't get Streamlabs OBS set up. I don't have my notifications set up, so apologies for that. Um, anyway, apologies for no raid notifications, but thanks to everyone who's new here. But yeah, hopefully for next stream I'll be able to set up notifications and stuff, so I'll be able to know. Anyway, for anyone who's coming in to asking about MMR, sorry, I don't work on the team that does matchmaking, so I can't really tell you anything about it. Um, but anyway, as far as priorities in the year coming, to sort of get back to the question I was just talking about, um, my hope is that we'll be able to ship stuff that players want in every patch. We'll see if we actually hit that goal, but like my hope is that we can put like actually exciting new systems content in every patch. Like maybe one patch it'll be a new rune, and one patch it'll be a new items, and one patch it'll be a big, rework to an item system or something like that. But yeah. Oh, by the way, if you're not gonna be, let's see here. I don't think I have any mods. How do I whatever. I won't worry too much about it. You already said adding new runes is not possible because of the UI. Um, anyway, so it is possible for us to add one keystone, by the way. We would have to do some resizing of the existing runes, so we have literally one slot to work with, is something that we could do. But after that, we would have to rework the entire UI system to add new runes. But yeah, so with a little bit of work, we could add one keystone. I'm here lurking. Oh, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I think anything that's getting really extreme, if you could, if you could get rid of that stuff, I'm not really in the business of just sitting here and allowing people to tell, if someone's, getting really extreme, then just take care of it if you could. But don't worry about it too much. Is that the garlic from what's it called? Vampire Survivors? I've actually been playing a lot of that game recently. It game's pretty fun. Anyway, okay. So hopefully that's a good representation of the priorities. But if not, let me know. I have a super elaborate question that might stump you. You ready for it? Okay, buff Evelyn. We would like to buff Evelyn, but she's currently being pretty limited by her higher MMR win rate. She has. I was talking about this a bit earlier, but she's an example of extreme MMR skew, where she's really weak for most players, and then she's like decent for good players, like very good players. So it's difficult. Difficult one to do. Why Guardian isn't a rune on Wild Rift, but an item called Protector's Vow? That was just a design decision made by the designers. They said, hey, let's make, like, we like Guardian, but we don't have space for it in the rune system. Let's make it an item. Um, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. The Guardian effect is cool, so making an item seems fine. Oh, you're biased. I see, I see, I see. Uh, Sorry, again, anything from people asking about like matchmaking or queuing system, that's not me. I only work on systems and balance, which is only the in-game stuff. So apologies, but I can't really tell you. Also, that shaking garlic is great. Anyway, so again, I'm gonna try and speed through some of these questions here and not look too much at chat. But yeah, I'm going to try and get through some of the remaining questions here. So can we have two active items instead of just one in the future? Unlikely. I think we would sooner add more active items and potentially make like a system that would allow you to upgrade your active item or something like that. That's something we've talked about that we think would be cool. Um, but two active items is very unlikely because the current active item is very intentionally designed to only require one button, right? If we add another active item, we'd give you another button, and the screen real estate is already pretty limited, especially for people on smaller phones. A lot of the system is very intentionally designed to use the screen real estate that is available on smaller mobile phones, which we have to consider. So It is very unlikely that we'll do 2 active items ever, I think. Not impossible, though. Uh, is there a specific process that led to Lee Sin being buffed? Because a lot of us felt that he was already the best there is. Yes, the specific process was that he was extremely tragic for the overwhelming majority of players. And at the time, win rate wise, and even by pick and ban rate at the time, for most players, for even for very high MMR players, he was just okay, right? Like, the reason why we buffed him, we knew that that would be a contentious change, but we were really sad about like Lee Sin being basically unplayable for most players. And so the like, and I think in hindsight, we probably if we would do it all over again, I think we probably wouldn't have buffed Lee Sin. Like being straight, like being honest with you, is like if I were to go back to that patch, like with all the knowledge that I have now, if I were to go back to the meeting where we decided to do that now, I'd probably say let's just not do it. And let's like sit and evaluate longer, and see what happens if we don't do this because we were sad. Basically, it's like a combination of like, look, we were really sad about how badly Sin was for the overwhelming majority of players, and that led us to be, um, that led us to do things that like maybe wasn't like was really just value like very value negative for higher MMR players. Our thoughts were with the health regen that really wouldn't affect higher MMR players a lot, and I think that's probably true. Like win rate wise, he didn't really change at all in higher MMRs. Like to be clear, the buff did accomplish what we wanted. It didn't really buff higher MMR, and it did slightly buff lower MMR players, because they're not as good at using safeguard and all the vamp and stuff. Um, but like again, going back to it, it's like I think we probably shouldn't have done it. Honestly, not to say that like not to like dunk on myself or anything like that, but it's like um, you know sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you just do something and it turns out in hindsight it wasn't the right call. Uh, and that's okay, right? It's like even if your failure rates like 5%, we ship so many things every patch, we'll fail every so often, right? And the 5% failure rate's really not that bad. Um, so what about Jace's earliest use? I've talked a little bit about Jace, but Jace's main problem is that in higher MMRs, he's godlike in the early game. So interesting thing about Jace, I don't think I've mentioned this yet. It's like his win rate curve in different elos is actually really different. In higher MMRs, his early game is like insane. He like wins early game a lot. Like he wins a lot of the games that end early, and then he falls off, like just whoop, like way down there, like in the late game. In lower MMRs, he's actually kind of the opposite, where he like early game he's like winning no games, and then he goes slightly up in the later parts of the games, like whoop. And so our current thought process is like, hey, if we nerf his early game and we maybe buff his scaling, maybe we can get his like MMR skew to be down a little bit. Well, we're talking about that, not guaranteeing that we're going to do it, but that's what we've been talking about for Jace specifically. Um, so that's kind of where we're at on Jace at least. Is like we've been looking at the differences in his win rate curve, whoop, in different MMRs and trying to evaluate like how we can maybe get them a little bit closer together, hopefully. So we'll see. Um, podcast questions, Pog. Yeah, some of these are from the podcast that you did, Stuart. I was actually there for that one live. I watched the podcast that Hells was on. I forget what they called it later, and a couple others later. But yeah, it's these I don't remember which these are from, but that's the point. When are you guys going to make Wild Rift TFT? Well, ignore that TFT is already on mobile. Yeah, we're making it. It's coming out tomorrow, actually. Wild Rift TFT's release date is tomorrow. Don't tell anyone though. Um, any plans to increase the pull distance on Thresh Hook? It feels like it covers a lot less distance from PC. I'm not sure what the difference in distance are, but I don't think that we're playing. Uh, I don't think that we're planning on doing any changes to Thresh's Hook, as far as I'm aware. I think that would probably be me doing it if anyone was. Are there any considerations of bringing back Evelyn's ultimate execute on epic monsters like she does in PC? We certainly haven't talked about it. If we were going to do Evelyn work to try and make her MMR gap smaller, which is something that we've done some testing internally for some things, and I don't think we've come up with anything yet that we're super happy with. That is something that we could definitely talk about. But I will note that the execute on epic monsters is very likely high MMR skewed, so it would kind of go contrary to our goals. So it's unlikely to be added, but it is not a guarantee. It's something that we could do if we were like, hey, this seems kind of free and just kind of satisfaction up for the Evelyn players. Like, that's a possibility, but I don't think it's super likely. So again, not impossible. Don't think super likely. All right, let me get okay. Let me get to these back to the questions in the doc again. How long have I been streaming? Almost 2.5 hours. All right, nice. Will Gale Force be added in the near future? Probably not. We did a visual indicator for Protector's Vow and a stat counter for Rod of Ages. Those would be good, yeah. I think stat counter for Rod of Ages in particular seems like good value. Um, Probably would need to go away when you're fully stacked, though. It's kind of complicated. Definitely doable, but probably doable. Or definitely doable, probably worth doing, would be what I'd say. Okay. Would Riot get good value from a PBE style system to test upcoming changes? So this is something that I think both of the podcasts that I spent the most time watching actually talked about, I believe. The truth here is that there is a like public test server in China, which makes sense because that's the most popular, biggest region. The PC PBE is a little bit different. It's there for testing a bunch of different things. Um, and how do I put this? It's not like the PBE in PC is there just for people to test upcoming changes and like for highly experimental changes, right? To be clear, the designers on PC sometimes use the PBE for that purpose, right? They might put something on the PBE and say, hey, what will the player reaction to this be? How will players interact with this content? But that is the vast minority of cases because in the majority of cases, it's usually better to do internal testing to get good reads on stuff before showing it to players. And there's definitely value for certain types of changes for showing them to players and seeing how they react before you decide if you're going to ship them or not. Um, but it's definitely not the majority of like potential changes you could do to the game. Like if and to put this in perspective, right? It's like keep in mind PC League has been out for like 12 years or whatever, right? So there's a lot of things in PC that have already been tried. There's a lot of things that are already known, and there's also like if you think about the total scope of changes that you could make in PC, right? If you think about that as like this like, I mean, how do I get this in the frame? Okay, here it is. So if you think about this total scope of changes as like this, right? Like all the stuff between my hands, um, a lot of this stuff, like if I cut all that stuff out, it's like a lot of that stuff is like very known quantities, right? So for them, a lot more of that work that they actually do is in this like very unknown quantity space, or sorry, a lot more of the work that they're uncertain about is in this unknown quantity space where they might get value from something like the PBE where they like show it to players and see like what the reaction is. Whereas in Wild Rift, it's like our known space is like I cut out like this much, right? It's like we don't know as much about the game or like understand the game as well because it's just a newer game and there's just not been as much development on it. Um, so we don't spend as much time working in like the space over here as an example where the value from like the experimental stuff is as high, right? We do some of these changes, um, but we don't do as many, and so we don't get as much value from the experimental stuff. Now, none of this is to say that we wouldn't benefit from a PBE, right? It's like I'm just saying some of the reasons why it would be, maybe not as clear value for us as it is for PC, because for sure we would get value from a PBE. But there's a bunch of things that we would, a bunch of issues that we would need to get over before we would need to like before we would get a lot of value from like experimental content on the PB of like one of them would be our patch line process, right? It's like our patch line process, I can tell you, even for internal tools, is like not spectacular. We don't get builds that often, and we don't have a good way to differentiate between like the release build and an experimental release build, right? We have a separate experimental build called Future, which is where we test all the upcoming content and stuff. But we would need a separate build, like another layer, for like hey, this is stuff that we want to experiment with, but not that we want to ship to players on the live servers. Like basically, there's a lot of complicated stuff talking about this, and we currently don't have the like the tech and the resources to set this stuff up. I don't really know, like I don't even know who would own a PBE on Wild Rift. Like I'm not sure where that would be, but like from a personal perspective of like, would I like this thing as a balance designer? Yeah, I would, especially if I could put stuff on it and show it to players. But it also would be a huge amount of work to create, and more importantly, a huge amount of work to maintain. And so I can understand why we don't have one, because the work it takes to maintain it relative to the amount of value I would get is probably not worth it at this time. But maybe in the future, I think is basically like the answer. The literal answer to this question of like, would we get good value from it is like yes. The question is more like, would we get enough value to make it worth the cost that we would pay? And it's like probably not, like the amount of man hours and like the tech that we would have to upgrade to make it work. At least right now. Maybe in the future that'll be different. At least I hope so, because I would love that. Um, is Wild Rift a priority for Riot Games? Like, for example, is there a 5-year game plan or plans for Riot to truly make this game successful? Yes, this Wild Rift is a long-term, is a priority. As all the games are, right? It's like, if you're asking like which game at Riot is most prioritized, that's not really like a sensible question, because Riot doesn't like sit around and is like, we're gonna put all our money into this game only, and all the other games are gonna suffer. It's like that's not what Riot's all about. It's like each game, has what it needs, and if a game needs more, like if it's struggling, or in some area, if it needs some more resources, that's something that the game can get, right? It's like, um, if it's a question of relative resource allocation between games, I have no idea. But I can tell you that it's not like Wilder just sitting over here like we're dying or anything like that. It's like, we have lots of positions open, but so does TFT, so does PC League, so does Valorant. Like basically every team right now, as far as I know, is hiring lots of people. So it's not like one of the teams is getting like less allocation or anything like that. It's like pretty much everyone wants to have more people. Probably not a big surprise. So, okay. But yeah, as far as the priority, like, yeah. Gen rework, I've already talked about that. You can look in the VOD if you would like to. This is another thing that I saw in podcast. I think this was from Hell's podcast, I believe. Where it's like, why does it seem like Riot only pays attention to issues brought up by very popular video/content creators? And the implication here is like, oh, Riot doesn't care about the smaller content creators or like smaller pieces of content being made. It's like, I assure you, there are people at Wild Rift that watch lots of different, like a very wide variety of content creators, including the smaller ones. The truth here is that I think there's been some weird coincidences a couple times where larger content creators have created a video talking about like some X issue that was already being worked on internally that was about to ship. Like it's not some like it's not some crazy conspiracy that a big content creators, creates a video complaining about X feature, and then in the next patch there's like a big, update to that feature. It's like we don't make those updates in a week, right? It's like that stuff is planned very far ahead of time. Like I've been talking about, it's like for us to do items takes a long time, like multiple months, for us to do like an item or a rune or whatever. So when you see something in the patch, it's not like we just, made this up and we're just like, oh, some big streamer decided to complain about this thing, so we're going to fix it now. It's like there have been definitely a couple of instances where the big streamer has identified an issue that we've been aware of for a while, and it's like, yes, that's a, that's not, I wouldn't really call it a coincidence, because it's kind of like a, yes, the big streamer has identified an existential problem with the game. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. If they play the game a lot, they probably will eventually end up recognizing some significant problems, just like we do internally. So I don't really think this is a like, you know, this is again, I don't want to call it a coincidence, because it's not, right? It's like it's like a necessary correlation of like we spend a lot of time working on stuff and the content creators spend a lot of time working on the game. So um okay, so hold on, let me catch up with chat a little bit. Do some champs deserve to be weaker in terms of balance if they're too easy to play? Not really. Like, so here's the reverse of this question, which is how I would, this is all right. Let me game designer you for a second. Here's the reverse of that question. If you play 3,000 games of, what's a hard champion? I don't know. Good example of a hard champion. If you play 3,000 games of, actually, it's probably better if I do a non-Wild Rift champion for the sake of, keeping this pure. Let's say you play 3,000 games of Azir. You have a 100% win rate. Everyone who plays 3,000 games of Azir has a 100% win rate. Is that fair? No, obviously not, right? Like that's very clearly not fair, right? Like like if you put 3,000 games of Azir and you have a 100% win rate, yeah, you put in a lot of effort. The champion is super hard. Maybe for the first 1,000 games, you only won 10% of your games or whatever, right? It's like, and maybe the champion is insanely hard and you feel like you should be rewarded for your struggles. But if you have a 100% win rate, you are stealing all of the agency from all of their players, right? The other 9 players in your game literally don't matter, right? So using that as sort of the converse here, right? It's like if we said a champion is weaker because they're easier, we're basically saying that when you pick pick an easy champion, you are actually robbing yourself of agency, which is sort of true, right? It's like it is actually kind of true that already happens. The question is, to what degree should that be true, right? Like it's not about like should a weaker champ or should a easier champion be weaker? It's about like, hey, what is the balance between difficulty versus agency in the game, and where do we draw the line on how weak a champion should be because because they're not very hard to play, right? Like, um, basically the difficulty here is in assessing like where the line should be. It's not about whether champions should be balanced around their difficulty curve or not, right? Because ultimately, if we balance exclusively around difficulty curve, do you know how the game would look? Do you know what champions, if we were balancing exclusively around the like the skill of like it requires to play the champion, you know what champions we would go buff right now? We would be buffing Yasuo. We would be buffing uh, Ezreal. We would be buffing Riven, right? We would buff a bunch of champions that it wouldn't even be a good for the ecosystem if we buff these champions, right? It's like Yasuo players don't want to